Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the ability to rise today in this House and to add to the debate of C-46, an act to amend the criminal code, offences relating to conveyances, and to make consequential amendments to other acts. This title, though, Mr. Speaker, is not really a description of what this bill will do, which is to change the impaired driving laws in Canada, ensuring that we deal with not only drug impairment, but increased sanctions on those who drive while impaired by alcohol. This is a complex subject, one that I and the NDP are very concerned about. I agree that this bill is important, and to be clear, nothing is more important than protecting the Canadian public. And the NDP has been a long-time advocate for improving and ensuring deterrence of the impaired driving tragedies that we all face in our ridings. This is in no way the only component of this bill, and I have many concerns with it and its true effectiveness, and I would like to outline some of them here. When one speaks about impaired driving, they often refer to the victims of these crimes. Without a doubt, the human cost of impaired driving is huge. Every year, hundreds of people are killed and tens of thousands are injured as a result of impaired driving crashes in Canada. This affects our friends, family, neighbours, and colleagues, virtually everyone in our lives. There is perhaps no greater pain than losing a loved one so suddenly under such circumstances as impaired driving. The frustrations of the legal system are even more significant on top of that pain and the anger of one's loss. I agree that impaired driving has had a long history of heartbreak in our country, and that changes need to be made in order to prevent any more tragedies from happening in Canada. According to Mothers Against Drunk Driving Canada, in 2010, impairment-related crashes resulted in an estimated 1,082 fatalities, 63,821 injuries, and damage to 210,932 vehicles. There are also significant financial and social costs of impaired driving. There were a total of 181,911 crashes, costing an estimated $20.62 billion. This includes the costs of the horrific fatalities, injuries, property damage, traffic delays, hospital costs, and the costs of first responders, such as police officers, firefighters, and ambulance attendants, to say nothing of the psychological impact of our frontline workers, Mr. Speaker. Naturally, the government should want to put forward legislation that prevents people from needlessly suffering. My question is, why don't they want to do it right? The largest problem with this bill centers around roadside mandatory alcohol and drug testing or screening that is proposed in Section 320.27. This would be the first time this occurred in Canada, and the authority given to the police to stop someone on a whim. This is very dangerous and murky waters that we are wading into here. Currently, under the law, an officer must have reasonable suspicion before they can stop someone. Many civil liberties groups have raised concerns with these proposed changes, stating that the removal of reasonable suspicion would create a disproportionate targeting of racialized Canadians, Indigenous people, youth, and other marginalized groups. Mr. Speaker, I'm the proud mother of 2 young black men. So to me, I'm additionally concerned about the uncertainties that this bill creates. The issue of carding and unfair racial profiling is an issue in many communities, and many other Canadians must deal with this on a daily basis. So why would the government create a piece of legislation that could make this a potentially worse problem? Why would they put our valued police officers in such a precarious position? This issue also may be challenged in the judicial system and subject to defeat under Section 1 of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Section 1 guarantees the rights and freedoms set out in it subject only to reasonable limits prescribed by law as can be demonstrably justified in a free and democratic society. Random and mandatory breath tests for alcohol screening are also included in this bill, and they too could be challenged under Sections 8 and 9 of the Charter, which address the rights of individuals to be secure against unreasonable search or seizure, and the rights of individuals not to be arbitrarily detained or imprisoned. So again, I must ask this House why the government would create a piece of legislation that could impact the rights of individuals as laid out by the Charter. This is incredibly short-sighted, Mr. Speaker. There is also the problem with how the police are expected to test and screen people for impaired driving from cannabis. The proposed plans are to use the roadside oral fluid drug screeners. In Ontario, the pilot projects which use these devices are unreliable, and there is no standard chemical test that states when a person is impaired. And to further this problem, the legislation does not name any per se limit. The legal limit that would show impairment is not in this piece of legislation. Instead, the government has stated that this shall be prescribed by regulation. I'm reminded of a recent court case from last year that shows why it is so important for the government to create legislation that is thorough and well thought out. This case involved a Toronto police officer and 3 young black men. The officer pulled their car over despite any evidence, stating that he was relying on a type of sixth sense to suss out usual suspects. These young men were handed 4 charges, including one of assaulting a police officer. The judge threw out these charges, stating that upon seeing this older vehicle being driven by 3 young black males, the constable's immediate conclusion, despite any lack of evidence, was that they were up to something. It was more probable than not that there were no articulable case for the stop, but that the real reason for the stop was racial profiling. As legislators, it's imperative that we find solutions to problems. We shouldn't be creating more. By not creating clear and well thought out laws, we leave those who must enforce those laws and those who must abide by them literally stranded. The NDP is asking for a more effective piece of legislation, one that deals with the problem of impaired driving holistically. We need a robust public awareness campaign that educates the public and police about the dangers of driving while impaired, either with alcohol or drugs. Through education, you could effectively teach and deter people, thereby avoiding the problem in the first place. This was a major recommendation from the Task Force on Cannabis legalization, and regulation. They stated quite accurately, develop a national, comprehensive public education strategy to send a clear message to Canadians that cannabis causes impairment and the best way to avoid driving impaired is not to consume it. The Canadian Automobile Association helped fund a study by the Ottawa-based Traffic Injury Research Foundation that suggests legalization will pose incredible challenges for managing pot-impaired drivers. The CAA also commissioned a poll that found that almost 2/3 of respondents are worried our roads will become more dangerous after legalization. Now, Mr. Speaker, there are a lot of misconceptions that are out there about marijuana usage in our country, and we certainly have heard a great deal of those in this House today. In the poll that took place, some people even believe that taking pot makes them a better driver. And suffice to say, there's a great deal of research that challenge and support these perceptions. It is the responsibility of the government to study this issue in more detail, educate the public on the best information available, ensure that they put forward legislation that effectively and fairly addresses this problem. New Democrats want a smart bill that truly works to protect Canadians. Repeatedly, experts and their research show us that education and prevention are truly bigger deterrents than sentences. This is why we believe that the bill must focus more heavily on these issues. Yes, impaired driving is the #1 cause of criminal death in Canada. There are lives at stake. And I believe that as legislators, we must include effective provisions to stop people from ever making the choice to drive impaired. I have to say, Mr. Speaker, that it's disappointing that the Liberals on the committee defeated 5 out of 6 NDP motion amendments and the majority of the opposition members' amendments as well, supporting, of course, all of the government's amendments that were brought forward. I think there was an opportunity at the committee to get this bill right, and it's disappointing that now it's come to the House without that having taken place. This issue is too important to put Band-Aid solutions on. We must do this correctly, and we must do this intelligently in order to end the long, heartbreaking history of impaired driving in Canada. Nothing is more devastating than the loss of a loved one, and we must do everything we can to prevent the tragedies that occur on our roads. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for Scarborough Southwest.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I just wanted to bring to the member, first of all, thank you for her remarks and her very thoughtful remarks on a number of aspects of this legislation. She mentioned her concern, Mr. Speaker, about police officers pulling people over on a whim. And I just wanted to bring to her attention that the legislation actually deals with this issue. And if she just referred to Section 320.27, subsection 2, in which, concerning mandatory alcohol screening, and it provides within the legislation a requirement that a police officer must be in the course of a lawful exercise of powers under an act of Parliament, an act of the provincial legislature, or arising from common law. There is a requirement in the legislation that the police must be in the exercise of a lawful authority. And quite frankly, Mr. Speaker, if a police officer was to pull over someone, not in the exercise of a lawful authority, but based on bias, or in particular, the insidious practice of racial profiling, this would render the stop unlawful. It's unlawful under Provincial Police Services Act, it's unlawful under provincial human rights legislation, it's unlawful under the Canadian human rights legislation, and therefore such a stop would be unlawful, and any test that would be administered would be rendered inadmissible. And so I just wanted to bring to the member's attention, the legislation very clearly requires that a police officer be acting in the lawful performance of a duty as prescribed in law before being able to make the demand for a mandatory alcohol screening test. And that protection I would submit to the member opposite, and I'd like her comment on it if I may, that with that requirement, if she believes that that would be sufficient to address her concerns. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Or Essex.
Mr. Speaker, I think that the member opposite is disregarding the vast amount of evidence that exists under this current type of law in our country that sees racial profiling, that sees carding, that sees driving while black, driving while Indigenous, people being randomly stopped. This is an epidemic in our country that needs to be addressed. So to say that the current laws that we have prevent that is patently false. There is so much evidence to counter that, and certainly from the member's own riding, I believe, and region of Toronto, that there is incredible evidence showing that this carding is happening, that people are being randomly pulled over unlawfully, without any reason, just on a whim. So I don't know how the member believes that the system is working well for people of color in our country right now, because I can tell you, Mr. Speaker, that those very people do not feel that the system is being put in the way that it should be, that police officers are using their authority in order to stop people randomly. And I would like to say that I'm very pleased that our new leader, Jagmeet Singh, has handled this issue provincially very well and has called for a federal ban on carding. And that's exactly the direction that we need to go in. And opening up in this particular bill, C-46, the ability for police officers or frontline people to continue to just randomly stop people without any just cause will result disproportionately in people of color being impacted in our country. And that's a fact. So I'm not confident in this bill stopping that from happening in any way, because it continues to be an epidemic in our country.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires? The Honourable Member for Kootenay, Columbia. I always get the two of you mixed up. My apologies.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I'd like to thank my colleague for her great speech. Many Canadians, of course, don't tune in to committee proceedings, and I'm wondering if she'd like to share with us some of the more important elements that the Liberal members of the committee voted down that would have made a great deal of sense to have included in the bill.
The Honourable Member for Essex, in 45 seconds or less, please.
Mr. Speaker, I'm happy to. And the one amendment that we were able to bring forward out of the six says that within 3 years we will have the Auditor General do a report. I do know that another one of our amendments really tried to have everyone stopped at designated checkpoints so that we would avoid this kind of random stopping of individuals. So if we did support to have that checkpoint where everyone would be stopped, so there wouldn't ever be the impression or the impact that people of color within our country would be disproportionately represented. And unfortunately, Mr. Speaker, the Liberal members of the committee voted that down. So it's disappointing that we wouldn't see this applied in a way that would be just blanket to every individual that we're capturing within that space versus allowing police officers still within our country to card and to target and racially profile.
Resuming